You're watching Face to Face. I'm your host, Tim Vince, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Paul Garner, geoscientist.
Oh, it's very good to be with you, Tim.
And Paul, I remember meeting you, it must have been about 2010-ish,
Yes.
maybe 2011, with a good mutual friend in a pub in Cambridge. And I had a friend who's got your surname, but I suddenly discovered someone who was absolutely had a clear calling on the subject of creation. And at that time, we started talking about so many wonderful creationists who were highly qualified academically, but not in a specific field that they were speaking on. And you felt called to actually get trained in geoscience so that you could be an authority on that subject.
Yeah, that's right. Even as a young boy, a young Christian, I knew that geology and biology were the two sort of key areas in the whole creation-evolution debate, and that I needed to be familiar with those, or at least become a specialist in one of them. And so I went into geoscience, and we can probably talk about how that journey unfolded.
Amazing. Are rocks dead?
They're inorganic. They're dead.
Okay. I'm going to ask all these sort of layman's questions now, but
yes, but covered up by all the sort of green stuff that the biologists study. But we like places where we can actually get to see the rocks. Yeah.
So as a young kid, as it were, I and ask you, but I just remember my son very interested in rocks, and so even as a toddler, he'd spot a rock and pick it up. Was that like you?
Yes.
You were interested in the difference between different rocks.
Oh yes, I had a rock and fossil collection as long as I can remember.
Wow. I
remember my dad, coming back with fossils that he would give me, and I sort of had this growing collection.
Yeah.
Soon takes over the house.
And how do you age? Go straight to the jugular. Age fossils. Or the rock,
yes,
which they're contained.
You can't really date fossils directly. The way that geologists typically try to date rocks is they look for rocks that can be dated radiometrically. So you're talking about things like lava flows or ash beds that might be sort of interbedded with fossil-bearing rock layers, and you try to get some constraints on the age of the fossil that way. But of course, then that gets into the whole area of radiometric dating and how accurate is it, and obviously as a creationist I have a particular view about that.
And how far back it can go, because it's got its limitations. But before we get into all of that, because I've already got a couple of questions stacked up in my head from where I live down on the coast. How did you come to know the Lord? How did you come into the Christian sphere?
Yeah, well, I wasn't raised in a Christian home. My parents weren't believers, except in the most nominal sense, really. They sent me to Sunday school. I remember going to Sunday school at the local Anglican church and being taught Bible stories by, well, she seemed a very old lady at the time. I'm not sure exactly how old she was. Everybody's old, aren't they?
Your age.
When you're very young. A lady called Miss Sparrow, and she used to teach us Bible stories using fuzzy felt.
Okay.
So I remember all of that. But it wasn't until I was 10 years old that a school friend invited me along to a Tuesday night youth group that ran at the local evangelical church. And I went along to that and ended up going to their summer camp. And it was at the summer camp I became a Christian. So I was listening to, I can't remember the details, but I was listening to the messages that were being given at the evening meetings.
And they gave an appeal.
And they must have given an appeal. And I remember praying,
Yeah.
I think it was on the last night of that camp.
Wow.
My mum and dad came to collect me at the end of the camp. There was sort of a barbecue for parents, and they came to collect us. And I remember telling them, I've become a Christian. And I think they were rather bemused by this, because they would have just assumed, well, we are Christians, aren't we?
We're Anglicans.
Or, we're sort of nominally, we live in England, we're Christians. So I think they were a bit bemused by it. But they then became interested in what had happened and began to come to church. And then it wasn't long before both mum and dad became Christians as well.
Wow.
My dad ended up becoming a church pastor eventually. So that was.
Was that through you? Did you have an influence on them?
Yeah, well, in the sense that they were intrigued what had happened to me, and then came to church, and and they actually both became Christians sort of independently of one another.
Yeah.
And were fearful about telling the other and finally plucked up the courage and realised the same thing had happened to the other at about the same time.
And it's lovely not to have a tension, you see, and to have their support and your support for them. That's a wonderful story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, as a young Christian who was interested in rocks and fossils, because I'd sort of grown up, with all of these amazing books about the history of life and dinosaurs and these incredible dioramas that show all these reconstructions of fossil plants and animals. As a young Christian, here I am reading the Bible and what it tells me about creation. And because I thought, well, how does this all fit together? And I think when I was still a very young Christian, I don't know how I came across it, but I came across some creationist literature. I remember I had a copy of Sylvia Baker's Bone of Contention.
Yes,
it was
I've read
kind of a magazine
I read
format.
that. I love it.
Lots of people, grew up sort of reading that.
Yeah.
Sylvia, of course, became a good friend of mine later on in the Biblical Creation Society. But so I read her magazine. I read a book by Roger Price called In the Beginning. I read Monty.
Is that Roger Price, the kind of Bible teacher from Chichester?
Yes, yes, that's right.
He's an interesting guy. Yeah.
Yes, so I didn't know him, but he'd written this book about creation, and I read that. I read Monty White's book, What About Origins? Eventually, somebody gave me a copy of the Genesis Flood. That was a bit more advanced, but Henry Morris and John Whitcomb's book all about the flood, that was sort of a defence of flood geology. And so this was all sort of very influential on my thinking. I was sort of seeing how the Bible and science sort of fitted together.
Yeah. And you can't answer all the questions, as it were, but there's as many questions that are thrown up about a naturalistic worldview as the other. I'll just say, when I was a kid in my geography class, I had, the teacher, was talking about all of these billions of years, and I just popped a question. I said, I see all of these pictures of dinosaurs on the wall, and it says prehistory. And I was only a little kid and very cheeky. If it's prehistory, how can we know?
Right. Yes, I mean...
Very good question, he said. Well, I was only about 12.
There is a sense, obviously, as Christians, there is no such thing as prehistory.
Yeah.
We have history from the beginning, recorded by the Creator.
Yeah.
So I was sort of trying to piece all of this together. I knew I wanted to study geology. I knew that from a very early time. So when I left school, I did A-levels. I remember wrestling with some questions that I had at that time. I remember talking to Gerald Duffett, who was associated with the Biblical Creation Society, and he lived near me, and he would have me over at his home, and he'd answer my questions, and that was all very helpful. And then, I had to decide what to do for a degree. I went to study for my first degree, which was a combined science degree. And it was geology and biology. I chose those two subjects, as I said at the outset, because I knew those were the two key areas in this origins debate. I majored in geology. Wow. And it was when I was sort of doing that first degree that I first encountered really difficult problems, the kind of hard problems that you don't encounter when you're studying geology at a lower level, but you begin to sort of
give me an example.
Find difficulties.
Give me an example, without throwing us completely off the sense.
I mean, this is really part of my story, so I'll tell you about one problem in particular. And it might sound a bit arcane to anyone who's not interested in geology, but it was about the origin of granites. Now, granites are igneous rocks, so they're formed from a hot magma, and they form below the Earth's surface. And I remember, studying my degree, I was being told this story about how granites were formed. So they form by the partial melting of the lower crust, and that generates granite magmas, and that's a slow process. And then these magmas they were thermally buoyant, so they would then slowly rise through the crust. Yeah. And they would form these enormous balloon-shaped bodies that would just force their way through the overlying crust, a bit like sort of rising blobs in a lava lamp, And they'd move from maybe 20 miles depth up to a few miles depth, where they'd reach some point of thermal equilibrium. And the time it would take them to make this journey was 150,000 years, something like that, because they literally had to force their way up. And then when they collected in the sort of upper part of the Earth's crust, they would form these enormous bodies called batholiths. You'd get lots of granite magma that would coalesce and form these enormous bodies, a bit like the one that underlies southwest England. You know, we have surface exposures at Dartmoor and Land's End. And then they would cool down and crystallize and turn into rock. And the cooling process was estimated to be really long. You know, it took a long time to conductively cool these bodies. And then, of course, you had to unroof them. You had to erode the overlying rocks so they were exposed at the surface. I was looking at this and I was thinking, well, the timescales here are just enormous. How can I fit this into what the Bible tells me about creation in 6 days and a worldwide flood, you know, a world that's only a few thousand years old? And I have to say, as a geology student, that gave me some sleepless nights. You know, other people perhaps have sleepless nights about other things, but as a geology student, that's what was worrying me.
It's lovely to hear this as part of your personal testimony. So we've got to get to a conclusion.
And so what do we do? I guess the question is, you know, when you confront difficult problems, this was the first time I really had to grapple with things like this. What do we do? And I think it's easy to feel overwhelmed. I think lots of Christian students go to university. It's the first time they're away from home, you know, from all of their sort of usual networks of church and family, and that they start learning about things. It may not be geology, it may be in other disciplines that challenge their faith. And I think what happens for many in the sciences is they'll look for kind of an easy solution. They'll try to just reconcile evolution and an old Earth with the Bible. They'll basically say, well, you know, somehow it's got to fit together, and if I'm being told about these long time scales, I've got to fit them into the Bible somehow. Sadly, some other Christians, I think, lose their faith. They abandon the faith altogether and sort of walk away when they're faced with these difficult problems.
But they forget to ask the difficult questions of the other side. So you're carrying things sometimes where you don't have a complete picture. I mean, who was down in the magma measuring it all those hundreds and thousands of years ago? You know, there are unknowns.
You make a very, very good point, because so often we think that all the problems are on our side. And actually, I think if you suddenly say, well, let's try and accommodate evolution into the Bible and you know, old ages, you actually don't solve all your problems. What you do is you swap them for another set of problems. So, you know, I think what we need to do is be patient, because science is about the solving of problems. And what I've discovered is that, you know, we may not have all the answers. We may not have all the answers within our lifetimes.
That's right.
But very often, if we're patient and we diligently look for alternative explanations of the data, then this is what happens.
Isn't that the essence of faith in Hebrews 11? That you know, they died without seeing the fulfillment of the promise that they believed in. So that is, you know, actually an essential element. It says it twice in Hebrews 11.
Yeah, absolutely. We should trust God. It's not as if we haven't got reasons to trust God, even in the face of perplexity and difficult problems, whatever those problems are. Well, the lovely kind of punchline to this story, if you like, is that problem that so exercised me as a geology student, now, all these years on, looks very, very different. Because in the years since I was a student, the understanding of granite formation has undergone an entire revolution. Almost every aspect of that story that I just told you about granites has been completely overturned. So now geologists think that the formation of granite magmas in the lower crust is actually a rapid process. It happens on timescales of, you know, years, decades, centuries, not much longer timescales. The rising of these massive granite bodies, there was always a problem with that. How do they make space for themselves when you have these enormous bodies of magma? Geologists have almost entirely abandoned that idea now. They think about granite magmas rapidly rising through the crust along narrow fractures. And the timescales are now thought to be just weeks, months to transport these magmas into the upper crust.
Amazing.
And then the cooling of these bodies. One of the things that we've discovered is, although they have a very large surface exposure, granite bodies are often sort of like sheet sheets in shape, so they don't have deep roots. And instantly that makes the cooling problem more easy, because you have a large surface area to a relatively small volume, which brings cooling times down. And when you factor in convective cooling into the equations as well as conductive cooling, the timescales start to shrink.
Yeah.
So that whole story that seemed to me such a profound challenge to, the biblical picture, I'm not saying that we've solved all of the problems, but it now looks radically different than it did when I was a student. So I think the lesson is, to have patience, look for alternative ways to understand the data, trust God. If the Bible speaks clearly about something, trust God that there is going to be a solution to the problem, even if we don't know what it is yet. And also I'd say, see the problems not so much necessarily as problems to be solved, but see them as an opportunity to get to know God and His Word better.
That's good.
Because God has given us this world, He's given us the tools of science to investigate the things that He's made, the things that He's done in history. And we should see it as a quest to understand God's creation better. And as we understand His creation better, we get to understand Him better.
You're taking away my next question, which was how did you get to start with the Biblical Creation Trust was it 2002?
Yes.
Because I met you in probably a 2010-11. You before you did your postgraduate geoscience degree, you did quite a decade, a stint.
I did.
How did you get to be involved there?
Well,
Which you probably already answered in the last 10 minutes.
Well, so after I graduated, I got involved with the Biblical Creation Society, and I began to develop a speaking ministry, and I edited their journal. And eventually my speaking ministry kind of grew to the point where we were trying to think, how can we support this full time?
Yeah.
And eventually we set up a separate charitable trust, Biblical Creation Trust as it is now. I began work in October 2002. God was very gracious in providing the funds for me to leave my secular employment at the time. So I had about 10 years with Biblical Creation Trust as a researcher, speaker. And
did you manage to sidestep, as it were, the internecine kind of controversies within creationism, because you had this specialist field of geology, which it sounds as though you can bypass some of the other arguments if you stick to geology?
Yeah, I've always specialised in geology.
Yeah.
I have dabbled in some other things, but geology is really my area.
Yeah.
So I've sort of tried to stick to what I know. I know best. I decided, as you said, to go back and do a postgraduate qualification in geoscience, specialising in paleobiology.
Yeah.
So that's fossils and the history of life.
Wow.
And I did that at University College London. And there was an interesting story there, because my supervisor, I did my thesis research project was about dinosaurs, dinosaur diversification. It was a very evolutionary project, but I chose it deliberately because I wanted to understand better, how evolutionary scientists analyse and interpret data.
Very good.
So I wanted a particular professor to sort of be my supervisor. And I remember having a meeting with him in his office where I knew I would have to tell him, that I was a creationist before I thought it was fair that, he made the decision whether to supervise me or not. And I went into that meeting with fear and trembling because I didn't know how he would react. When I told,
he said, "Wow."
He did say, "Wow." He was sipping on his coffee at the time, and I told him I was a creationist, and he said, "Wow."
Yeah.
And then I think he sort of gathered his thoughts and said, "Well, what kind of creationist are you?" And I said, "Well, a creationist of the young Earth variety," which got another wow.
Yeah, excellent, absolutely brilliant.
But anyway, we had a really interesting discussion. He asked me what did I think were the theological problems with evolution, which gave me an opportunity to talk about the connection between sin and death and what this means for the cross and why Jesus had to die. So that was a great opportunity to have that conversation with him. And at the end, I explained I wasn't there to crusade from my
No,
creationist
that's
position.
good.
I was there to learn. I was
Yeah.
there to
Because
study.
he would be in trouble with his peers and with campaigners and others.
Exactly. I wasn't
And the
there-
internet was sort of gaining traction in those days, so it could have,
Yes,
caused all sorts of viral problems.
Yes, I didn't want
Yeah.
to be a troublemaker, in the department. I was there I was there as a student to
Yeah.
learn. And I think he appreciated that. I think he appreciated the honesty of telling him that I was a creationist. So he agreed to supervise me. And I have to say, he treated me the same way any other student was treated. I have no complaints whatsoever. I think I'm very grateful for what he taught me.
Brilliant.
And for the way that he was willing to accept me
Yeah.
just as another student.
Yeah, so I'm going, because we're going to run out of time and I won't be able to ask this question. I live down on, not in the southeast, with the chalk cliffs, which, apparently came through all of these organisms, and there just seems to be such a massive volume. I mean, my cliffs are 10 metres, but the Beachy Head cliffs are,
Yes.
massive volume of layers, and you think, how on earth could that have happened when it all looks as though it all came in one blob?
Yeah.
I mean, of course, notwithstanding the flint, which is interspersed throughout, but which causes
the
challenges.
The chalk itself is made up of these tiny sort of skeletons, these marine sort of planktonic organisms called coccolithophores. And they produce these sort of calcium carbonate skeletons that sort of make up the chalk, and vast quantities of them. But one of the things that we know is that when the conditions are just right, when the temperature of the water's right, and the nutrients in the water and the chemicals in the water, these things can bloom. You get these sort of algal blooms that turn the water white. And it seems that at some point during Noah's flood, there was an episode where these things just went kind of crazy on a worldwide scale, because you find the chalks all the way from North America, right across Europe, right down into Turkey. There's even Upper Cretaceous chalks in Australia. So they're enormously widespread. They're quite pure, which again is interesting, because if they were laid down rapidly, there wasn't time for an intermixture of other sediments to sort of contaminate them. Lots of evidence that the organisms in the chalk, because you have other fossils, sea urchins and even vertebrate skeletons are fossilized in the chalk. Evidence of rapid burial. Evidence that these things were
I want to ask you, it's
being
absolutely
deposited
brilliant,
at such
because,
tiny amounts.
how do we fit it into a little interview about your Christian testimony? But the erosion, so you've mentioned the erosion of granite. I look at the English Channel, where we've got chalk on the other side of it, and I think, well, at the rate of erosion, because my cliff's going, as it were, we've got arches and stacks and other things appearing. It wouldn't the English Channel be much wider if we'd had a long time scale of erosion?
Well, it's actually a very good point, because in the kinds of timescales that conventional geologists deal with, you can erode entire continents down to sea level.
This is the point.
Multiple times over.
Yeah.
So there is a problem, with the kind of erosion rates. Interesting thing about the English Channel is that they've done sort of radar surveys on the floor of the English Channel and found these massive channels. And it looks as if the English Channel was eroded quite quickly. It was we were cut off from mainland Europe when the ice sheets melted, and glacial meltwater was kind of ponded up behind this sort of rock ridge that then got breached. And it would. That's how soft is chalk. If you had a real. And it looks as if we
deluge.
they talk about the day that we got cut off from mainland Europe.
I thought that was 2016.
Yeah, Brexit 1.0. So when this catastrophe happened in the post-flood ice age that cut us off from mainland Europe.
Yeah, amazing. So you've passed your degrees, and you are, still in the saddle, so to speak. So.
Yes. Yeah. Writing. I've written a couple of books, The New Creationism, that's kind of an introduction to the whole issue. Fossils and the Flood.
You have a collection of rocks, because I remember you wanted to have an exhibition at Moggahanger Park.
Yes.
And I wanted it as well, but the
Yes.
trustees of the time, we don't want to.
Yeah,
it's
got a
risky,
collection of rocks
but,
and
that's
fossils.
fascinating.
I do a podcast with Dr. Todd Wood, who's a biologist, a creation biologist in the States. We do a fortnightly podcast called Let's Talk Creation, which you can find on YouTube. I have a speaking ministry. I do some research. I still carry on doing geological research.
So the rocks that you have in your collection, they all have a story, as it were. So I'd have thought that could keep you going on a lecture circuit, or even,
yes,
in a residential context for a long time.
There are some great stories associated with particular fossil stories of rapid burial. One of my favourite fossils in my collection is a fossil fish that came from Brazil. It's the Santana Formation in Brazil. These fish are so well preserved, and you can see it in the one that I've got, where you can see individual scales, really immaculately preserved. These fish, when they've studied the way that soft tissues of modern fish break down upon death, they've realised that these fish had to be fossilised within probably less than 5 hours of death. So fossilisation in this case was really, really rapid. And there are great stories like that with many of the other things I've got in my collection.
I go into, I'm sorry, I'm all dumbing down all of this great learning, but you go into an underground car park that's just been built, and a couple of years later you've got these stalactites, which again people date to be so old, but things can, at least all I would like to see is at least there's an acceptance of an alternative explanation for things, but in academia, often they shut down the debate.
There's a huge opportunity for creationists to do original research in all of these areas. And I recently was at the International Conference on Creationism in the States. That was last year, and I was with some students presenting some research that we've done together on radiometric dating, on the order of the fossil record. There's huge opportunities for anyone who wants to.
And if I remember right, you also speak in secular forums as well.
Have done, yes. Occasionally those opportunities come up, which is very interesting. It's going to speak to a hostile audience.
Fantastic. So good. I enjoy that myself. So Paul, it's wonderful to just talk.
Thank you very much.
It's just a little dip, as it were, into what you're doing. But what a blessing.
Great to be with you.
To be with you. And sorry we don't meet each other more, because it's however many years ago. 2010.
It's been a while.
A long time ago. Thank you so much. God bless you. Okay, so you have been watching Face to Face with Paul Garner. Don't know why you're not a doctor or a professor, but thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you next time.